All right, so this is our third and final homework video for this week. I'm going to be talking more specifically about how to write an opening and closing statement. And yes, even if you're a rebuttal person, I do want you taking notes and paying attention during this little experiment here or video. And basically, even if you're doing the rebuttals, there's going to be some tips and tricks that are good for rebuttal people as well as just the team, the debate team in general. So, yes, I want everybody paying attention and taking notes tonight. So, we're going to be learning about the two most important parts of the debate, which is the opening and closing statement and the major differences between the two so that the audience experiences them as they were meant to be experienced, because the opening and closing are very different. There are some similarities, but they should, by and large, have different types of arguments being used throughout, so they should look a little bit different. All right, let's get started. So, first of all, some tips and tricks for the debate team as a whole. I really need you guys to work on communication. You need to be sharing your facts with each other. Any of the important pieces that are going in the opening statement, the rebuttal people need to know as well, as does the closing statement person, because the closing statement person needs to be repeating those facts so that it really sticks in the minds of the audience. So everyone in the group needs to have all of the facts so that the group itself can argue at any point during the debates. Yes, the rebuttal people are strictly doing the rebuttal section, but opening and closing statement people, you can jump in at any time. And the rebuttal people need to know those opening statement facts and figures so that they can repeat them and help close out their 4-step rebuttal process. So you guys really need to communicate with each other. Use the Edmodo small group board wall, and maybe even Skype together at home to really make sure as you're working on these components that you guys are one cohesive team. Really take the idea that you are a debate team to heart and you need to be working together. So the other important piece, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit next week, is that the team really needs to research and know both sides. We're going to go more into detail on this next week, but it's important to note that you guys are finishing up your research, and you really need to understand both sides of the debate to prepare for your rebuttal section and know what the main arguments are going to be for both sides. That way you can better prepare your rebuttals, and you just know what's coming from the other side, so you can better quick think, go back and forth. Sorry, I just snapped my fingers if you heard that in the background. Yes, I'm sitting here at home creating this video and talking using my hands and everything as if I was in front of you guys in real life. So when you hear snaps and pounds on the table or whatever, that's just me being an idiot at home. All right, so moving on. You are also required to have a presentation for the opening statement. So you can do a PowerPoint, you can do a Prezi. Rebuttal people, you're going to be in charge of this section. While the opening statement and closing statement people are writing their speeches, you need to prepare a few rebuttals ahead of time, as well as create your PowerPoint for your team. Just because I don't think it's fair that the opening and closing statement people are writing a full-fledged speech while you're just sitting around staring at them. So you need an activity too, and that will be to create the rebuttals as well as the PowerPoint to go with the opening. Okay, as far as the opening statement, it must have an intro. You need to have at least 3 main ideas or arguments, and those arguments need to have an assertion, reasoning, and evidence. An assertion is basically a statement trying to prove your argument, like what you're actually arguing. So our first main idea is this. That's your assertion. Your reasoning is the because part of your argument. You're offering support. And the evidence is if you can find any historical acts, examples, statistics, or scientific information. If you can interview someone or get any expert advice, that would all go in that section. So I'm going to show you an example here. So let's pretend that we're hearing a debate talking about boxing and how it should not be a sport and we should not be allowing boxing to happen. So the assertion or your statement, your argument that you're proving is that boxing is intended to harm its participants. That's your main idea, number 1. Let's assume that's the main argument, number 1. So you're saying boxing is intending to harm the participants. So your reasoning is, unlike other sports in which physical collisions and body damage occurs, the point of boxing is to do harm to an opponent. The goal in boxing is to knock out the unconsciousness that is the result of brain damage. Now you'll notice as I was doing the reasoning piece there that I couldn't help but emphasize certain parts. That is something that opening statement and closing statement really people need to pay attention to. When you emphasize and prove how silly or stupid something is, just by the tone of your voice, it will resonate with the audience. So by saying that the point of boxing is to do harm to an opponent, I'm using the tone of my voice to show how stupid that is. And by saying that the knockout is the goal, which is the unconsciousness as a result of brain damage, again, I'm using the tone of my voice to prove emphasis. That's something also we should be keeping note of and trying to do throughout our speech. So the evidence in this case would be to actually provide some examples of some of the injuries and damage that boxing actually causes. So the example here is boxers succeed in doing a great deal of harm. Levander Johnson died from brain injuries. Both Query brothers passed away before the age of 55 from lifetime of beatings. Michael Watson is confined to a wheelchair. Gerald McClellan is in a coma. Muhammad Ali has Parkinson's disease from second impact syndrome. He's probably one of the most well-known people out of all of those that I just listed. According to the Journal of Combat Sport, as many as 1,000 boxers may have died in the past century, with many thousands more seriously injured. So clearly boxing is not a sport one would really want to get into if they don't intend to be hurt. So actually, if I'm following the 4-step rebuttal process, the part I just said would be the fourth and final step, bringing it back to my main argument and wrapping it up. So this is the 3-part of the 4-step rebuttal process. But in your actual body of your opening statement, having these 3 pieces for each main argument or main idea is really important. You don't necessarily have to write all of this down. I just wanted to make sure that I gave you an example. All right, moving on. So an opening statement also should have a conclusion. So this is where you're going to wrap up your speech, remind the audience what your main ideas and arguments were. In a speech, it is okay to be repetitive. I can't say that enough. I know I've said that in the last couple of videos. It is not okay to be repetitive in an essay. In a speech, it is a good thing. I think in last night's video, and I've probably said this in class a couple of times, when you're talking in front of an audience, it is good to repeat yourself because you don't want that syndrome in one ear, out the other. The more you repeat, the more likely you are to have the audience remember what you're saying. Okay, tips and tricks for the opening statement. Again, I want to remind you, do you have a slogan or some sort of repetitive piece to make the audience remember what your team is arguing? It should be, again, about 2 to 3 minutes in length. If you're writing it out, if you're handwriting it out on pieces of notebook paper, you should shoot for about 3 to 4 pages. Don't forget to time yourself as you practice and go through the speech. If you're below the 2-minute mark, you will not be considered proficient. So really practice and time yourself. Usually the opening statement, again, is more logical and expert argument types. So you're listing your facts and your evidence. The closing is more emotional. We need to remember that. Really try again also to use great persuasive and academic language, quote where appropriate, use good sources, that sort of thing. And I would like to remind you that during the opening statement, you are going to be interrupted with the other team's rebuttals. So be prepared and practice your speech. And I would really recommend in your notes or your note cards, whichever one you're doing, that you need to practice and tell yourself where to pause and let the other team speak. Make them stand and wait for you. You pause and stop when you're ready. That way you don't get flustered and lose your spot when you come back to continue your opening statement. Write down in your notes, pause here, let the other team go. Okay, moving on to the closing statement. So the closing statement is much shorter, but it should still have an intro, body, and conclusion. It's shorter compared to the opening. You need to restate your debate team's 3 main ideas. Remind your audience your most important ideas. Do not introduce any new information. Use the same slogan or repetition that was used in the opening statement so that you sound cohesive. You are a team. You should communicate with each other and make sure that your 2 pieces match. You need to make an emotional connection with the audience. And like I've said in another video, you're not necessarily required to have a PowerPoint, but sometimes it does help if you're floundering and don't know how to make that connection with the audience. Use imagery and figurative language, similes, metaphors, paint a picture for the audience. That will help with that emotional connection piece. And then finally, the closing statement needs to be at least 1 to 2 minutes long. You will not be considered proficient if it's under a minute. The closing statement you need to remember as far as tips and tricks is the last thing that the audience is going to hear from your team. So people are more likely to remember the closing because it's what they heard last. Also, it really should summarize the main ideas of your debate and leave the audience wanting to vote for your team for the win. I don't need to remind you, I don't think, that you are hoping to win because it will give your team some extra points. It could be the difference between a B and an A. So you really do want the win. Again, remember to emphasize those key points of your debate. And remember, there's no rebuttals during this section, so you're not going to be interrupted. Sometimes, again, while not required to help with your emotional connection, a presentation is helpful. So differences, opening statement uses logical and expert, whereas closing is more emotional. The opening has an organized intro, body, and conclusion, and the closing is a little bit shorter but should still have all those three parts. The presentation needs to go along with the opening, and your closing should repeat the most important arguments and facts as stated in the opening for the closing. You are going to be interrupted with rebuttals from the other team during the opening, but you will not during the closing. The opening needs to be 2 to 3 minutes long, whereas the closing is only 1 to 2 minutes. And then finally, remember to use really persuasive language, quotes, survey statistics, facts, and interview information if at all possible. And the closing is the last that the audience hears from your team, so you really need to make it count. All right, you're finished for today. So please go back down to the digital whisk and submit your questions and summary, and I'll check your notes in class tomorrow. I'm getting excited for the debates. Hopefully you are too. I'll see you later.